Whilst the first half of the Bible, the Old Testament, is also the sacred text of Judaism, the New Testament brought with it a new faith, Christianity. The New Testament was written after the death of Jesus and records the early teaching of Christianity. The New Testament is a collection of 27 books, which are attributed to 8 different authors over a period of approximately 50 years, most of which are written in Koine Greek. The word testament was used by early translators of the scripture as the equivalent to the Hebrew word berith, meaning an alliance with God, the Yahweh of Israel. It is a New Testament because it is a new alliance, formed again between the people and God through Jesus, new in comparison to the alliance with God formed with Moses in the Old Testament. The first 4 books of the New Testament are the 4 Gospels, which talk about the life and teaching of Jesus. The next book, the Acts of the Apostles, narrates the actions of the apostles in setting up the Christian church in Syria and Palestine, and the work of Paul in the early church. There follows 13 or 14 letters, also called epistles, written by Paul to a variety of different Christian communities. There are 7 other letters, which are to Christians in general. The final book, Revelation, or the Apocalypse, is addressed to 7 churches and tells of a vision of St. John. As all of the books of the New Testament were written in the second half of the 1st century, according to most scholars today, they were written by people who were direct witnesses to Jesus, or by authors who knew these witnesses. These books were not written in the order they appear in the New Testament today, with the Gospel of Mark likely to be the earliest Gospel, the Book of Acts and the letter of James, both very early writings. Almost 2,000 years on from when the books of the New Testament were written, it is difficult to establish evidence for the authors beyond the tradition. For example, tradition attributes the letters of John and the book of Revelation to the Apostle John, but they may have been written by another John, such as John working in Ephesus. For many Christians, the content of the New Testament is more important than the particular authors. Many of the writings of the New Testament are in the form of letters to early Christian communities in different places, written by Paul, represented in the image on the right of the screen, and the other authors you see on the left. As the letters were addressed to particular people in particular places, they took time to spread throughout Christianity and become accepted into one book. It took until the 3rd century, 200 years or so after the books were written, for them to start to become accepted into a canon. A canon is an accepted list of books by the Church. The canon of the New Testament was finalized by the 4th century in the West. It was not until the introduction of the printing press in the 15th century that we were able to reproduce texts identical to the original. We know that writings change over time, as they are copied out by new writers, and occasionally adapted to the situation in which they were being used. The texts of the New Testament were also translated into different languages. There have been attempts made to correct errors in the text over the centuries, but there remain some inconsistencies. The Catholic Church published the Latin Vulgate in 1592, seen in the picture on the left, in an attempt to use just one version of the scripture. There are not many early versions of the New Testament to compare, but some parchment versions remain. There are 2 from the 4th century, 5 from the 5th century, and 20 before the 8th. There are also fragments written on papyrus that have been found in Egypt. There is an old text of St. Augustine from the 4th century, which is in Latin, as well as early Syriac and Egyptian versions. Some of these translations are from an earlier date than the versions found in the original Greek. There is a general consensus today about the texts of the New Testament, although some discrepancies will likely always remain.